The morning fog hung low over the Italian coastline, thick enough to taste the salt and dampness on every breath. It was November 1943, and Corporal James Whitmore of the British Eighth Army crouched behind a crumbled stone wall, his Lee Enfield rifle resting against his shoulder. The war in Italy had become a grinding, miserable affair, with German forces dug into seemingly impenetrable defensive positions along the Gustav Line. Every yard forward cost blood, and the men were exhausted, cold, and running low on hope. Whitmore wasn't supposed to be here. He was a farmhand from Somerset before the war, a man who knew the rhythm of seasons better than the rhythm of military drilling. But he had one skill that set him apart. He could shoot. Growing up hunting rabbits and foxes across the Somerset levels, he'd learned to read terrain like other men read newspapers. He understood light, shadow, and most importantly, he understood water. The Somerset levels flooded every winter, turning his childhood landscape into a vast network of shallow lakes and channels. Young James had learned to hunt waterfowl by reading the ripples and reflections on the surface, understanding how light bent and twisted across moving water. It was a peculiar education, one that seemed utterly useless in the muddy trenches and shattered towns of the Italian campaign, until it wasn't. The incident that would define Whitmore's war began with frustration and desperation. His unit, the Somerset Light Infantry, had been pinned down for 3 days outside a small town called San Pietro. German snipers, well-trained and equipped with excellent Mauser rifles fitted with Zeiss scopes, controlled every approach. They were positioned in the bell tower of an old church behind reinforced positions that made direct engagement nearly impossible. British commanders had tried artillery, but the ancient stone structure absorbed the shells with stubborn resilience. Infantry assaults had been bloodily repulsed. Captain Harold Pemberton, Whitmore's company commander, was losing men daily to the German marksmen. Every movement in daylight drew fire. Supply runs became desperate nighttime affairs. Morale was crumbling faster than the buildings around them. In situations like these, conventional tactics had failed. What the British needed was something unexpected, something the Germans wouldn't anticipate. Whitmore had noticed something during his third morning, trapped in their position. The town sat beside a small river, swollen with autumn rains. Between his position and the church tower, the river created a natural barrier about 60 yards wide. The Germans clearly considered it an advantage, a moat protecting their strong point. But Whitmore saw something else. He saw the water's surface, relatively calm in the early morning before the wind picked up. He saw how light from the rising sun reflected off that surface at predictable angles. And he remembered something from his boyhood hunts, how bullets could skip across water like flat stones if you understood the physics, if you knew the angle. His grandfather had shown him once, shooting at a duck on the far side of a flooded field. The old man had deliberately fired low, letting the bullet skip across the water's surface to catch the bird from an unexpected angle. It was an old poacher's trick, illegal but effective. The bullet lost some velocity with each skip, but over short distances it retained enough energy to be lethal. More importantly, it came from an angle that targets never expected. Whitmore studied the problem with a hunter's patience. The German snipers in the bell tower had excellent cover from direct fire, but their position overlooked the river. They could see the water, but they clearly didn't consider it a threat. Why would they? Water was an obstacle, not a weapon. He began making calculations, rough at first, refined over hours of observation. The distance from his position to the water's edge was about 40 yards. The river itself was 60 yards across. The church tower rose another 100 yards beyond the far bank. Total distance, roughly 200 yards, well within the effective range of his Lee Enfield. But the angle was wrong for a direct shot. The Germans had positioned themselves too well. However, if he could fire across the water at the correct angle, If he could make the bullet skip once, maybe twice, it might gain just enough elevation on the far bank to reach into the bell tower from below, from an angle the Germans had never anticipated defending. It was an absurd idea. Even Whitmore recognized how unlikely it sounded. When he first mentioned it to his sergeant, the response was predictably dismissive. Sergeant Mills was a professional soldier, a veteran of North Africa, a man who believed in proven tactics and military doctrine. Skipping bullets off water sounded like something from a boy's adventure story, not serious military strategy. But Whitmore persisted. He asked permission to take a single test shot at dawn when the water was calmest. Mills refused. They couldn't waste ammunition on foolish experiments, and besides, any shot would give away their position. The conversation ended there, and Whitmore returned to his post, frustrated but not defeated. He continued his observations. He noticed that the German snipers changed shifts at predictable intervals. He noticed that they grew complacent during the quiet afternoon hours, occasionally exposing themselves for brief moments. He noticed the exact pattern of light on the water as the sun moved across the sky, and he waited. The breakthrough came when Captain Pemberton visited their section of the line. The captain was a young officer, only 24, but he'd proven himself willing to listen to his men, especially the ones who'd kept him alive so far. Whitmore saw an opportunity and took it. He approached Pemberton after dark, when the German positions were quiet. He explained his theory carefully, drawing diagrams in the dirt with a stick, using his knowledge of angles and reflection to make his case. He talked about how naval guns had once used ricochet fire to extend their range, how artillery pieces in the 18th century had bounced cannonballs across flat ground to reach behind fortifications. He connected his farm boy's trick to legitimate military history. Pemberton listened. He was skeptical, certainly, but he was also desperate. 3 days of losing men to unseen snipers had taught him that conventional approaches weren't working. And there was something about Whitmore's quiet confidence, the way he spoke with the authority of someone who truly understood his subject, that convinced the captain to at least consider the proposal. They discussed the physics. A rifle bullet, traveling at roughly 2,400 feet per second, would maintain significant energy even after skipping off water, provided the angle of impact was shallow enough. Too steep and the bullet would simply penetrate the surface and dive deep. Too shallow and it wouldn't gain the necessary elevation on the far bank. The angle needed to be precise, probably somewhere between 10 and 20 degrees. Whitmore had already calculated this. He'd observed the water, measured distances by eye, factored in the ballistic properties of the .303 Mark VII ammunition. His proposed shooting position offered nearly the perfect angle. He would aim to strike the water about 20 yards from the far bank, allowing the bullet to skip once and carry upward into the base of the bell tower. The risk was considerable. If he missed, if the shot simply splashed harmlessly into the river, he'd have revealed his position for nothing. The German snipers would immediately begin hunting for him. But if he succeeded, if this crazy theory actually worked, they might eliminate one of the enemy marksmen and break the deadlock that was bleeding them dry. Pemberton made his decision. Whitmore would get his chance, but only one. They couldn't afford to waste ammunition or risk exposing their position repeatedly. One shot at dawn, when the light was right and the water was calm. If it worked, brilliant. If it failed, they'd never speak of it again. The night before the attempt, Whitmore couldn't sleep. He reviewed every calculation, every observation. He thought about his grandfather, about those foggy mornings on the Somerset levels, about the peculiar education that had prepared him for this improbable moment. He cleaned his rifle with obsessive care, checking the bore, the action, the trigger pull. Everything had to be perfect. Dawn came cold and gray. The fog was lighter than usual, which was good. Whitmore needed to see the water clearly. He took his position behind the stone wall, arranging his equipment with deliberate precision. His spotter, Private Davies, crouched beside him, peering through binoculars at the bell tower. The German snipers were beginning their morning routine. Through Davies's binoculars, they could see movement in the tower. One figure appeared at the opening, silhouetted briefly against the sky behind him. This was the moment. The light was right. The water was calm, everything aligned. Whitmore settled into his firing position. He'd done this thousands of times, but never with so much riding on a single shot. He controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate, entering that state of absolute calm that separates good shooters from exceptional ones. He aimed not at the bell tower, not at any visible target, but at a specific point on the water's surface about 20 yards from the far bank. The mathematics of the shot required him to think in 3 dimensions. He wasn't just shooting at a target, he was shooting at an angle, trusting physics and fluid dynamics to carry his bullet where conventional ballistics couldn't reach. His point of aim looked absurdly low to anyone watching. It looked like he was shooting at the river itself, which, in a sense, he was. He exhaled slowly, held his breath at the natural pause between breaths, and squeezed the trigger. The Lee-Enfield barked, the sound echoing across the water. Whitmore kept his eye to the sight, tracking the bullet's path. He saw the splash, exactly where he'd aimed. The bullet struck the water at a shallow angle, skipping like a stone. For a fraction of a second, he lost track of it. Then, impossibly, there was a second impact, a puff of dust from the stone wall at the base of the bell tower, right at the level of the firing position. From the tower came a strangled cry, brief and sharp. Through the binoculars, Davies saw the German sniper jerk backward, his rifle clattering down onto the floor of the tower. The figure collapsed, visible for just a moment, before others rushed to pull him back into cover. Silence fell across the battlefield, a stunned, disbelieving silence. Whitmore lowered his rifle, hands trembling slightly from adrenaline. He'd done it. The theory had worked. The bullet had skipped across the water, gained elevation on the far bank, and struck the German sniper from an angle he'd never thought to defend against. Captain Pemberton arrived within minutes, having heard the shot and its result. He stared at Whitmore, then at the river, then back at Whitmore again. The young officer's face showed a mixture of astonishment and grudging respect. What he'd just witnessed shouldn't have been possible according to any military manual he'd ever read, and yet here was the proof. The immediate tactical advantage was obvious. The German snipers in the bell tower, suddenly vulnerable from an unexpected angle, became far more cautious. Their rate of fire dropped dramatically. British movements across the sector became safer. But Pemberton saw something larger. He saw a technique that could be replicated, a new approach to an old problem. Within hours, word of the shot had spread through the British positions. Men whispered about the farm boy from Somerset who'd figured out how to skip bullets off water like stones. Most dismissed it as exaggeration, another tall tale from the front. But a few, the ones who'd been there, who'd seen it happen, knew better. The German response was predictable once they understood what had happened. They repositioned their snipers, moving them to locations where water couldn't be used against them. They became warier of river crossings, more careful about positions that overlooked bodies of water. The tactical landscape shifted, even if only slightly. But Whitmore's real struggle was only beginning. The British Army, like all military organizations, was fundamentally conservative. New tactics required approval, documentation, testing. They required someone with authority to champion them through layers of skepticism and bureaucracy. And while Pemberton believed in what he'd seen, convincing his superiors was another matter entirely. The first formal report met with polite dismissal. The adjutant at brigade headquarters suggested that Whitmore had simply gotten lucky, that the shot had been a fluke. Water, they argued, was too unpredictable a medium for reliable tactical application. The technique couldn't be reproduced consistently enough to warrant training resources or formal adoption. Whitmore found himself in the frustrating position of having proven his concept once, but being unable to demonstrate it repeatedly. The tactical situations that had made the shot possible didn't occur often. Rivers weren't conveniently placed near every German position. The specific combination of angle, distance, and water conditions was rare. He became known in his unit as the man with the water trick, respected by his immediate comrades, but viewed with skepticism by higher command. Weeks passed, the Italian campaign ground forward with its characteristic brutality. San Pietro fell, but at horrific cost. The Somerset Light Infantry took casualties, lost friends, gained a few yards of destroyed landscape. Whitmore continued to fight as a standard infantryman, his specialized knowledge gathering dust, unused and increasingly irrelevant. Then came the operation that would change everything. In January 1944, British intelligence identified a high-value target, a German general named Heinrich Krebs, temporarily stationed at a villa overlooking the Rapido River. Krebs was responsible for coordinating defensive operations across a critical sector of the Gustav Line. Removing him would significantly disrupt German command and control. The problem was access. The villa was a fortress, surrounded by multiple defensive positions, protected by a full company of elite troops. Direct assault was suicidal. Artillery strikes had been considered, but rejected. The villa's construction could withstand bombardment, and collateral damage to the surrounding town was unacceptable for political reasons. Airstrikes faced similar constraints. Traditional sniping angles were impossible. Every approach was covered, every line of sight blocked. The villa had one notable feature. It sat on a hillside overlooking the Rapido River with a terrace that provided commanding views of the surrounding landscape. This terrace was where General Krebs liked to take his morning coffee, briefing his staff while surveying the battlefield. Intelligence confirmed his routine was predictable. Every morning, weather permitting, between 0700 and 0730 hours, the general would appear on that terrace. The terrace faced the river, and the river, in that location, was wide, calm, and relatively straight. When the planning cell at division headquarters reviewed the options, someone remembered the report from San Pietro. The corporal who'd bounced a bullet off water and hit a German sniper. It seemed absurd, desperate even, but no other options existed. Someone suggested bringing Whitmore in for consultation. Whitmore arrived at headquarters with Captain Pemberton, both men uncertain about why they'd been summoned. They were shown reconnaissance photographs of the villa, detailed maps of the terrain, intelligence reports on the general's habits. Then they were asked a simple question: could the water trick work at this range? Could it work against a target 300 yards distant? Whitmore studied the photographs for long minutes. He measured angles with his fingers, calculated trajectories in his head. The distance was significantly greater than his shot at San Pietro, but the principle remained the same. The river at that point was nearly 80 yards wide, running almost perfectly straight. The villa's terrace was elevated, but not impossibly so. The morning light would be favorable, reflecting off the water at the right angle. The biggest challenge was the increased distance. At 300 yards, a standard infantry rifle was already pushing its effective range for precision work. Add the complication of a water skip, and the difficulty multiplied exponentially. The bullet would lose velocity with each impact on the water. The margin for error became razor thin, but Whitmore had spent months thinking about this problem, refining his understanding of the physics involved. He told them the truth. It was possible, but difficult. The shot would require perfect conditions, perfect execution, and a considerable amount of luck. The probability of success on a single attempt was low, perhaps 1 in 10. But with multiple attempts, with the ability to adjust and refine his aim, he believed he could do it. The officers exchanged glances. This wasn't the confident guarantee they'd hoped for. But it was an option, where none had existed before. They approved a reconnaissance mission to identify a suitable firing position and observe the conditions firsthand. Whitmore would have 3 days to prepare, to study the terrain, to make his calculations. If conditions were favorable, on the 4th morning, he would take his shot. The next 3 days were among the most intense of Whitmore's life. He was given access to detailed maps, reconnaissance photographs, even a captured German Zeiss scope to better study the villa. He interviewed every patrol that had operated near that section of the river. He learned about water currents, about how the morning sun reflected off the surface at different times of year, about the prevailing wind patterns. He selected his firing position with obsessive care, a ruined farmhouse on a low hill, about 250 yards from the riverbank. The geometry was nearly perfect. From there, he could fire at the optimal angle to strike the water approximately 30 yards from the far bank, allowing the bullet to skip once, maybe twice, and carry upward toward the villa's terrace. The total distance would be just over 300 yards, right at the edge of what was possible. He practiced with his Lee Enfield, firing at targets at various ranges, reacquainting himself with the rifle's particular characteristics. Every weapon had its own personality, its own quirks. He needed to know his rifle as intimately as a musician knows his instrument. He cleaned it again, checking every component, ensuring everything was perfect. The night before the attempt, Whitmore barely slept. He reviewed his calculations one final time, going over every variable, every possible source of error. He thought about what failure would mean, not just for himself, but for everyone counting on him. If he missed, the general would be warned. The opportunity would never come again. More men would die because of his failure. But he also thought about success, about removing a senior enemy commander, disrupting their defensive coordination, potentially saving British lives. About proving that his technique wasn't just a lucky fluke, but a legitimate tactical innovation. About showing the Army that sometimes the best solutions came from unexpected places, from farm boys who understood water and light, and physics in ways no military manual could teach. Dawn on the 4th day arrived with favorable conditions. The sky was clear, the wind minimal, the river calm. Whitmore and a small team, including Captain Pemberton and 2 observers from Division Intelligence, moved into position before first light. They settled into the ruined farmhouse, arranging their equipment quietly, waiting for the target to appear. 0700 hours approached. Through binoculars, they could see activity on the villa's terrace. Staff officers were setting up tables, arranging chairs, preparing for the general's morning routine. The stage was being set. Now they needed the principal actor to appear. At 07:15, General Heinrich Krebs emerged onto the terrace. He was a tall man, wearing his uniform immaculately despite the field conditions. He carried a cup of coffee and a sheaf of papers. He walked to the terrace's edge, looking out over the river, surveying his domain with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Whitmore settled into his firing position. This shot was significantly more complex than the one at San Pietro. The distance was greater, the target smaller and more distant, the variables more numerous. But he'd prepared for this. He'd rehearsed it in his mind 100 times. He knew what needed to happen. He aimed at his carefully calculated point on the water, adjusting for the slight breeze, the morning light, the current. His crosshairs settled on a spot that looked, to anyone watching, absurdly low. He was aiming at the river itself, at a point that seemed to have nothing to do with the distant terrace and its occupant. The observers watched through binoculars, holding their breath. Captain Pemberton clutched his own rifle tightly, as if physical tension could somehow will the bullet to its target. The moment stretched, infinite and frozen. Whitmore exhaled, found that natural pause, and fired. The bullet left the muzzle at 2,400 feet per second. A tiny projectile of copper-jacketed lead, weighing less than half an ounce. It flew on a trajectory that seemed wrong, too low, aimed at nothing important. Then it struck the river's surface. The physics of what happened next were complex, an interaction of velocity, angle, surface tension, and ballistics that few people truly understood. The bullet, striking at a shallow angle, didn't penetrate deeply into the water. Instead, it skipped, like a stone thrown by an expert hand, redirecting its energy upward and forward. It emerged from the water with reduced velocity, but still lethal force. It climbed toward the far bank, arcing upward in a trajectory that now made sense, that now pointed directly at the terrace. It covered the final yards in fractions of a second, invisible to the naked eye, too fast to track. General Krebs never knew what hit him. One moment he stood at the terrace edge, reviewing reports and drinking coffee. The next moment, a British .303 rifle bullet, having traveled more than 300 yards and skipped across 80 yards of river water, struck him in the upper chest. The impact knocked him backward. His coffee cup shattered on the stone terrace. Papers scattered in the morning breeze. German staff officers rushed forward, but there was nothing they could do. The general was dead before they reached him, felled by a shot that, by all conventional military wisdom, should have been impossible. Through his binoculars, Whitmore saw the target fall. He saw the chaos on the terrace, the rushing figures, the sudden understanding that they were under attack from an unexpected direction. For a moment, he couldn't quite believe it had worked. The shot had been so improbable, so dependent on perfect conditions and precise execution. And yet, he'd done it. The mathematics had been correct. The technique was valid. The team withdrew immediately, moving back through predetermined routes before German forces could organize a response. They reached British lines without incident, carrying with them the confirmation of what had happened. General Heinrich Krebs was dead, killed by a farm boy from Somerset, using a technique that military historians would debate for decades to come. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. German command structures in that sector collapsed into temporary confusion. Without Krebs coordinating their defensive operations, the Gustav Line defenses became less cohesive, less effectively managed. British intelligence exploited the confusion, launching operations that would have been more difficult with the general still in command. The single shot had strategic implications far beyond the simple removal of one officer, but the real story was Whitmore himself and what his shot represented. For months he'd tried to convince his superiors that his technique had military value. For months he'd been dismissed, patronized, told that his success at San Pietro had been mere luck. Now, with the confirmed elimination of a high-value target at a distance previously thought impossible for such methods, the skepticism evaporated. Within days, Whitmore was brought to Corps headquarters for debriefing. Senior officers who dismissed his earlier reports now wanted detailed explanations. How did the technique work? What conditions were necessary? Could it be taught to other snipers? What were its limitations? The questions came rapidly from men who suddenly recognized that they'd nearly overlooked a genuinely innovative tactical development. Whitmore explained everything he'd learned: the physics of bullet ricochet off water, the optimal angles of attack, the importance of water conditions, light and distance, the limitations imposed by rifle caliber and bullet construction. He detailed his calculations, his observations, his methodology. He transformed his intuitive understanding into something that could be documented, taught, and replicated. The Army, to its credit, responded with uncharacteristic speed. Within weeks, a training program was established to teach selected marksmen the water reflection technique. Whitmore himself became an instructor, sharing his knowledge with snipers from various units. The technique was documented in field manuals, analyzed by ballistics experts, incorporated into sniper training curriculum. Not everyone could master it. The shot required unusual spatial reasoning, an intuitive understanding of angles and trajectories that not all shooters possessed. It required patience, careful observation, and the ability to calculate complex variables under pressure. But those who could learn it gained a significant tactical advantage. They could engage targets from angles that seemed impossible, using terrain features that enemies didn't recognize as threats. The technique saw limited but effective use throughout the remainder of the Italian campaign and later in Northern Europe. Rivers, lakes, even large puddles became potential tools for skilled marksmen. German forces, once they understood what the British had developed, began taking precautions. They avoided positions overlooking bodies of water, became more careful about their routines near rivers, adjusted their defensive tactics to account for this new threat. But the innovation had broader implications beyond its immediate tactical applications. It represented something important about warfare and problem-solving. Sometimes the most effective solutions come from unexpected sources, from people whose unconventional backgrounds give them unique perspectives. Whitmore wasn't a professional soldier, wasn't a trained military tactician. He was a farm boy who understood water and light and patience. That civilian knowledge, applied to military problems, produced something genuinely new. The story also highlighted the dangers of institutional conservatism. The British Army had nearly dismissed Whitmore's technique entirely. If not for Captain Pemberton's willingness to take a chance, if not for the desperate circumstances that forced commanders to consider unconventional approaches, the innovation might have died with that first shot at San Pietro. How many other potentially valuable ideas, the story prompted people to ask, had been lost because they seemed too unusual, too far outside accepted doctrine? Whitmore himself never quite adjusted to his sudden prominence. He remained fundamentally a quiet man, more comfortable with his rifle than with the attention his innovation brought. He was commissioned as an officer, made a training instructor, given recognition and awards. But he maintained the modest demeanor of someone who'd simply done his job, solved a problem using the tools and knowledge available to him. After the war, he returned to Somerset, back to his family's farm, back to the landscape that had shaped his understanding of water and light. He rarely spoke about his service, about the shot that made him briefly famous in military circles. To him, it had been about survival, about doing whatever was necessary to keep himself and his comrades alive. The mathematics, the physics, the innovation, these were just tools toward that simple goal. But military historians preserved the story. Training manuals documented the technique. Ballistics experts studied the physics, confirming that Whitmore's intuitive understanding had been scientifically sound. The water reflection shot, as it came to be known, entered military folklore as one of the war's most unusual tactical innovations. The technique itself proved to have limited long-term military value. Modern weapons, with their greater range and precision, made such specialized approaches less necessary. Improved optics allowed snipers to engage targets from greater distances through conventional means. The specific circumstances that made water reflection shots useful, the combination of terrain, range, and target positioning, occurred rarely enough that extensive training in the technique became difficult to justify. But the principle behind it remained relevant. The idea that unconventional approaches informed by deep understanding of natural phenomena could solve seemingly intractable military problems. This lesson endured. Military organizations began paying more attention to soldiers with unusual backgrounds and specialized knowledge. They became more willing to consider techniques that seemed unorthodox, more open to innovation from unexpected sources. Whitmore's shot also became a case study in ballistics and precision shooting. The physics of bullets interacting with water surfaces had been poorly understood before his demonstrations. His success prompted serious scientific investigation into ricochet mechanics, into how projectiles behaved when striking fluid surfaces at various angles and velocities. This research had applications beyond military sniping. contributing to broader understanding of ballistics and projectile dynamics. In the decades following the war, as military technology advanced and warfare evolved, the specific technique Whitmore pioneered became obsolete. No modern sniper would attempt such a shot when other options existed. But the story itself retained power, serving as a reminder of human ingenuity under pressure, of how deep observation and understanding of natural systems could create unexpected advantages. Veterans who'd known Whitmore remembered him as a humble man who'd never fully grasped the significance of what he'd accomplished. To him, it had always been about solving an immediate problem, about finding a way to protect his friends and do his job effectively. The broader implications, the historical significance, the way his innovation challenged military orthodoxy, these matters seemed less important to him than the simple fact that his technique had worked when it needed to. Captain Pemberton, in his post-war memoirs, devoted several pages to Whitmore and the water reflection shot. He emphasized the lesson he'd learned about listening to unconventional ideas, about being willing to take calculated risks on techniques that seemed improbable. He credited Whitmore with teaching him that military wisdom didn't exist only in manuals and doctrine, that sometimes the best solutions came from people who understood the natural world in ways that formal training couldn't provide. The German perspective on the innovation was less well documented. General Krebs's death was recorded in their casualty reports, but the unusual nature of the shot wasn't emphasized in official documents. Some German after-action reports mentioned increased British sniper effectiveness near water features, suggesting tactical adjustments, but the specific technique doesn't appear to have been fully understood or replicated by German forces during the war. This lack of enemy comprehension was itself tactically valuable. Because the Germans never fully grasped what the British had developed, they couldn't effectively counter it. Their defensive adjustments were partial, incomplete. They knew they were vulnerable near water but didn't understand why or how to properly defend against it. This information asymmetry gave British snipers a persistent, if limited, advantage. In the post-war analysis of sniper operations during World War II, Whitmore's technique received careful study. Military researchers attempted to quantify its effectiveness to determine whether the resources invested in training were justified by the results achieved. The conclusion was nuanced. The technique was genuinely effective in specific circumstances, but required exceptional skill and favorable conditions. It couldn't be relied upon as a primary sniper tactic, but served well as a specialized tool for unusual situations. The psychological impact of the technique also merited consideration. German forces, once they became aware that British snipers could engage targets across water barriers, became more cautious near rivers and lakes. This caution affected their tactical decisions, constrained their movement patterns, imposed additional mental stress. The mere threat of such shots, whether or not they were actually attempted, created uncertainty and hesitation. Whitmore's innovation also influenced post-war sniper training doctrine. The emphasis shifted slightly toward encouraging marksmen to study their operational environment more deeply, to understand how terrain features could be exploited in unconventional ways. Snipers were taught to think more creatively about angles of attack, to consider approaches that weren't covered in standard manuals. The story became part of sniper culture, passed down through training programs and veteran accounts. New generations of marksmen learned about the farm boy who understood water and light, who'd figured out how to turn a river into a weapon. The specific technique might rarely be applicable, but the mindset it represented, the willingness to observe carefully, think creatively, and attempt the improbable, became part of the sniper's mental toolkit. In Somerset, where Whitmore returned after the war, local historians eventually documented his service. A small memorial in his hometown parish church includes mention of his unconventional contribution to the war effort. School children occasionally write reports about him, the local hero who used his knowledge of the Somerset levels to outsmart the enemy in distant Italy. Whitmore lived a long life, dying in 1998 at the age of 81. In his later years, he occasionally spoke to military historians and researchers, always emphasizing the collaborative nature of his innovation. He credited Captain Pemberton for being willing to take a chance, his grandfather for teaching him to read water and light, his spotters for their support and skill. He never claimed sole credit for the technique, always framing it as a team effort born of desperate circumstances. His obituary in the local Somerset newspaper mentioned his war service, but devoted more space to his farming career, his family, his role in the community. The water reflection shot was mentioned briefly, almost as an afterthought, a curious detail in a life otherwise dedicated to peaceful pursuits. This proportionality probably would have pleased Whitmore, who never wanted to be defined primarily by a single moment of wartime violence, no matter how unusual or historically significant. But in military circles, among snipers and historians and tacticians, the story endured. It became a teaching point, an illustration of principles that transcended the specific technique. It demonstrated the value of deep observation, the importance of understanding physics and natural systems, the potential for civilian knowledge to solve military problems. Most importantly, it showed that innovation could come from anywhere, from anyone, if circumstances and opportunity aligned. The technique itself remains documented in military archives, a footnote in the history of sniping, but a fascinating one. Modern ballistics experts can explain precisely why Whitmore's shots worked, can calculate the trajectories and energy transfers with scientific precision. But the calculations don't fully capture the human element, the intuition, the patience, the willingness to attempt something that everyone said was impossible. In the end, Whitmore's legacy isn't really about a specific shooting technique. It's about approaching problems with fresh eyes, about refusing to accept that conventional methods are the only methods, about trusting your own observations and calculations even when established authority dismisses them. These lessons remain relevant far beyond the specific context of World War II sniping. The shot that hit General Krebs at 300 yards skipping across the Rapido River on a clear January morning in 1944 stands as proof that the improbable isn't always impossible, that sometimes the farm boy who understands water and light can see solutions that trained experts miss. That innovation requires not just intelligence, but also the courage to propose ideas that sound absurd and commanders willing to take calculated risks on unconventional approaches. Whitmore ignored his doubters until he couldn't be ignored anymore. He trusted his understanding of physics and his observations of nature. He solved a military problem using knowledge gained from hunting waterfowl in flooded Somerset fields. And in doing so, he proved that the most valuable military assets aren't always the ones with the most training or the most advanced equipment, but sometimes the ones who can see the battlefield differently, who can transform ordinary features of terrain into extraordinary tactical advantages. The water reflection shot remains a remarkable footnote in the history of World War II, a reminder that warfare, for all its horror and waste, sometimes reveals unexpected human ingenuity. That even in humanity's darkest hours, there are moments of genuine innovation, flashes of creative problem-solving that transcend their immediate context and teach broader lessons about observation, persistence, and the courage to trust unconventional wisdom.